Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Iris Fox, and I want to extend a warm welcome to the Rough Edges podcast. Rough Edges exists to provide mental health education as well as faith-based messages in order to inspire growth and foster healing. In this podcast, I will guide you through my faith and mental health journey to dispel the stigma surrounding mental illness and to create a voice for those who wish to discover more about these topics. My hope is that this podcast will not only shed light on mental health issues, but will also reveal the intersection between faith and mental illness in order to bring growth and healing in our communities. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rough Edges. Today, I am joined by a very, very special guest. I am joined by Dr. Christina Edmondson. Dr. Christina Edmondson is an educator. She holds a PhD in counseling psychology and an MS in family therapy. She is a certified cultural intelligence facilitator with experience in nonprofit, higher education, and corporate sectors. Dr. Edmondson often consults with organizations about diversity and equity, as well as mental health and faith issues. Her work and insights have been covered in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Essence, and CBS News. And she is also the co-host of the Truth Table podcast, which is an incredible podcast all about just faith, love, liberation, blackness, mental health, like everything that you could think of, they cover it. So it's amazing. Thank you, Dr. Christina.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am grateful for your invitation, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation.
Yes, same here. So before we dive in, I want to know just a little bit more about you. So what are 3 things that you are passionate about and why?
This is quite the question, because I was just talking to someone the other day, and I said to them, I try not to be passionate about too many things.
Yes.
I try to have a short list of things that get my blood pressure up. You know what I mean? Like, because I'm just not trying to walk around this planet fired up all the time. But I do have some, and again, passion doesn't necessarily mean that you're angry, but it does mean that it requires a particular type of energy from you. So yeah, I'm certainly passionate about my faith, the kind of historic and global Christian tradition. So I'm passionate about what that means for me and what that means for the world, and how I show up in it. I'm passionate about issues of racial equity and justice. Much of that is a part of my it's informed by my faith convictions, and fueled by my faith convictions, but also because of my own social location, my own family's lineage as people who are descendants of survival of the transatlantic slave trade. And so racial equity is just incredibly important to me. And pushing the United States to make good on its propaganda and claims. It's important to me. I'm passionate about that. And I think, I would say I'm also passionate about, I have a background in counseling psychology with a kind of an emphasis in trauma. So I am passionate about people being well and made whole. And I think that also is in conversation with both justice and healing.
Wow, I really love that. And honestly, I agree with a lot of those.
Let's go. Let's go, Sarah.
Especially about racial equity and just like being like well, and living a healthy life. So definitely, I really love that. And as you expressed before, you have a career in like counseling, psychology, family therapy, and, among others, just like mental health. So what made you want to establish a career in that sector?
That's a good question. Yeah. People get into mental health work for all kinds of reasons, similar to like why people go to seminary or they become pastors or whatever. Our career paths tend to hold up a mirror to something about ourselves. That's how a psychologist would answer that question, right? Um, but so I actually started off in undergrad as a pre-med major. And I often tell college students that because they know that I'm not a medical doctor now, just to remind them that, like, you can start where you think you're going to start. You got
Right.
plans, but what do those plans really mean? And partly that was because I really love science. I love how to figure out how things work. And that's not just in terms of physiology or biology, but like society, right? And
Right.
structures and organizations. And so I have a real interest and passion around that. But I did move through some different majors when I was an undergraduate student at Hampton University. And so I eventually ended my major journey by hanging out with those socially radical sociology majors with an emphasis in race, class, and gender.
Mm.
And so still had an interest in figuring out how things work, but not so much about the physical body, but about society. And
Mm.
I think after getting that degree, I thought about going forward and getting a PhD in sociology. But I think I felt like I was a bit spent. I was like, oh, sociology is depressing. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, it's wild out here. It's wild. And I felt like I was good. I felt like I needed to get some skills as a practitioner. I was like, now I have some sense on the undergraduate level of how this thing works um, in terms of society and the unique temptations. And I was always putting it in conversation with my religious convictions, although I was not educated in a faith-oriented institution per se.
Mm.
Um, but it was after undergraduate studies that I decided I wanted to now pick up some practitioner skills. And so I went from studying society to studying the family as a system, right? Which is kind of like
Mm.
a mini society, right?
Right.
And so I went to the University of Rochester, which is in upstate New York, and got a master's of science degrees. Again, still love the sciences and how things work, and family systems therapy. And so that was my first journey into like the application of psychology and sociology. And that's how I ended up there. I don't know. I think I've always found the challenge of figuring out why things are the way that they are to be really interesting. And I consider myself a strategist, a problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much a problem maker, but a problem solver.
Right.
But sometimes people get that confused though, because if you're a person who is really geared towards wanting to solve a problem, you have to then name it as the problem that it is. And so people who don't want to name a problem as a problem will be like, you're a problem maker. No, 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 no. I'm actually a problem solver, but I've
Right.
got to name it as dysfunctional. I've got to name it as unjust in order for us to work on this together. And so
Oh,
I
yes.
kind of stayed within those studies and eventually found my way after working for a little bit in another graduate program, a PhD in counseling psychology. And so, I think I got there because, again, a real interest in people, how things work, and also wanting to have some practical skills on how to make organizations and systems and structures and people as well as possible.
Wow. That honestly, I have nothing to add to that that would make that any better.
Oh,
Just like that was amazing. And I just love the intersection of not only the mental health, but also the racial aspects. And I love how you were able to narrow it down to even like the family and just like examining the family system as like, just a part of society. And it's an integral part of society. So I just love how everything kind of overlapped. And, it's like you didn't discard of one area that you wanted to study just because you're like, oh, that didn't fit. Because a lot of times we have a habit of like, oh, I began here, so I have to keep going in this one thing, and everything else that I do has to align with this one career path. And
yeah.
I just love the exploration that you had on that journey.
Thank you. Listen, well, Sarah, first of all, I'm glad that it worked out. My parents, God bless them, they really did give me a lot of liberty to study whatever. I think they did, especially my dad. I think from the time I was like maybe in fifth grade up, I was like pretty convinced I would be a medical doctor. And when I shifted out of that, he didn't really give me a hard time. I'm sure he may have had thoughts and feelings about that, but I never experienced it, or I was pretty free. Well, and I recognize that there are some students who are not, for all kinds of reasons, actually for some really good reasons, like their family is investing a significant amount of time and resources in and them studying a particular thing so that they
Right.
can be a blessing to their family, particularly my international students. In some instances, it was like, what you mean you majoring in? No. You are majoring in these three things because this
Right.
is what the community, not just us, is funding, you know? So I do appreciate my parents, and I'm grateful that they had the ability to give me the space to figure that out.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I used my time and education to kind of figure things out. One of my old pastors just sent me a text message the other day about people who have degrees in psychology, PhDs, and apparently it's one of the most like versatile degrees. He's like, "You did good, you did good." And I was like, "See, this is exactly what I was thinking." No, I wasn't thinking that, but I'm glad that it worked out.
Yes, I love the validation. Like,
Yes. Thank you, Pastor.
well, among other things that you do, you are a co-host of the Truth Table podcast,
Mhm.
and that is a podcast that I have been listening to since like high school. So,
Whoa, come
yeah,
on, Sarah. I love that. Yes, I love
yeah.
it.
So I just appreciate the messages that you guys like talk about, and it's really empowering. So I just want to know what inspired you and your lovely co-host to
Uh-huh.
create the Truth Table podcast.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, we usually, this is kind of like the making of the band story, right? So that podcast really came to be in conversation with a good friend, Bo York, who did for a long time really has been the production arm of kind of editing and all those pieces for Truth Table. Had a conversation with Akemni Uwan, who is the other co-host of Truth Table, and asked her if she was interested in doing a podcast. And at that time, she was like, she didn't want to do that solo. And I get that too. I am a person who can probably do a whole lot of things independently, but I'm naturally, I think, a collaborator.
Yeah,
Um, and although that takes longer to collaborate, right? You got to win somebody else over into your ideas, right? But I actually think
yeah,
it benefits us. It really refines us to be able to collaborate when we develop our ideas. And so likewise, you know, she was like, he threw out some additional names, myself as well as our good buddy Michelle Higgins, who was the third member. We're now kind of a two-person podcast, but at that time we said, sure. We prayed about it. I definitely prayed about it. I had a sense that it would be a thing. Like I didn't know exactly what the thing would be, but I was like, this is going to be a thing. You know, I knew Sarah, like, let me talk to the Lord about this. And I did. And it was actually right as we were in the throes of the election season. This is the Trump and Clinton presidential campaign. And I think some people had a sense, even like my good buddy at Kemeny, they had a sense that this was going to be a really um, shocking political moment for the United States. And it was in the election of Donald Trump and the Trump administration and all that would come in under that particular administration, and the increase of polarization and the increase of militia groups and violence and you name it. It's an increase of a lot of things that were not good. And
right.
so, and we knew that we needed to address the political moment, which always is tied to a sociological and spiritual moment, even if we can't see
Mm,
it.
mhm.
And we knew that throughout history, Black women have been the voices that have been doing such. They've been doing this really intentional social interrogation. Social dissection is what Black Christian women, even specifically, have been doing in the United States for hundreds of years. When you think about Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells and
Yep.
Fannie Lou Hamers, there's something they all have in common. Black
Yes.
Christian women, and able to just tell the truth for the purpose of love.
Mm,
And so I think we decided to throw our very nowhere near as acclaimed and awesome as the people I've just mentioned, but decided to throw our voices into that for this particular moment. And I think and I think it caught on. And I'm so glad to hear, Sarah, that you even were listening to the podcast.
yes.
So
I
that is the
definitely
story of
was.
how it came to be. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. I really love that. And especially just like the collaborative effort. that it
Mhm.
took, because it's like it's one thing if one person is talking about it, but when you have like a whole table, if it were, of just like prominent Black women just speaking on these issues that nobody really seems to be talking about. I mean, now it's like the conversation is in circles, but it's almost like as if a tragedy
Yeah,
has to happen for those conversations to even be had, you know?
for
So I
sure.
just love how you guys came together and even added the faith element into it, you know,
Mhm.
because I appreciate that as a Christian Black woman myself, because it's like that is the element of truth, you know, to the things that we are talking about, and it's the hope behind it, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was
I
inspiring
think
to
I
me.
think that part that you just mentioned is so important, Sarah, because even if we don't have all of our truths together, because certainly Christians get it wrong, and we'll all be surprised one day soon about to what extent we did get
Right.
things wrong. But hope is so important, and to have a sense that even if I don't have it all together, there is a capital T truth was super centering, I think, for us, and it gave us, I think, yeah, it gives you kind of a shot of courage. But that hope is what becomes your anchor, that
Yeah.
you can tell the truth about how jacked up something really is, because you know that's not the end of the story. And hope, I think, can help you actually, despite what people think, hope can actually help you to become a real truth teller.
I love that. That was good. So, in addition to the Truth Tables podcast, you guys also published a book last
Yes,
year on April
yes.
26th,
Come
and
on
it's
now. You know better than me. I forgot. Yes, April 26th. It's all a blur. It's all a blur, Sarah.
yeah, but it was very recent. It's called Truth Table: Black Women's Musings on Life, Love, and Liberation, and it is
That's it.
already receiving stellar awards and like that's like and reviews too, like notably from Lecrae, Grammy award winning Christian artist. And also, you got a notable review from Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, who is the
Yeah.
founder of Therapy for Black Girls. And you also got nominated for NAACP. So, I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, this. I'm not sure when this will air, but yeah, we were nominated in the um, outstanding literary debut category for the NAACP Image Awards, and they are coming up very soon in Los Angeles. And so, uh, prayers
Oh,
that we
yes.
bring home the win.
Oh,
And
yes.
you'll know, Sarah, because you will not be able to shut us up. You will then be introducing me as Dr. Christina NAACP Image Award winner.
Oh, yes.
Edmondson.
Right.
It will change my name. So, but yeah, but in sincerity, the nomination is just huge, and we're so grateful to be in the conversation. And then it's not a category particularly for a book, for a religious or spiritual based book. It's kind of an open genre. And so, yeah, to be recognized in that way, we're just really grateful for the attention to this work that we created.
Yes. Congrats on the nomination and the win. I'm calling it now.
Hey, tell them, Sarah. Tell them. Y'all listen to Sarah.
But yeah, so the book, I started reading it. I'm not completely finished because I really love to give like all my attention to like good books. So, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's
But
it's 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 thick. It's a thick book.
oh yeah. But it's
Hmm.
worth it. It's really good so far. So, I just want to know, what lessons did you gain from like writing this book?
Oh, so, I wrote this book along with another project that I had happening. So I have another book called Faithful Anti-Racism. And so those books were written for slightly different audiences, although there is some intersection. But the Faithful Anti-Racism book that I wrote along with my friend and colleague, Chad Brennan, is really targeting people of faith, who who want to develop a stronger understanding about justice, about what God has to say from a Christian context, around issues of racial injustice and the role of the church in America in propagating and perpetuating racial injustice. And we historically research data, all that kind of stuff. So it's a particular audience. It's kind of devotional based. It's heavy on research. And but this book that the kind of the labor of love, the truth table book, Black Women's Musings on Life, Love, and Liberation. As I was writing it, I was not writing it at wearing my psychologist or university administrator hat or someone who deals with research. By any means, I was writing it as if I was in a room, speaking at like a women's conference, maybe, or what I would want to hear people address topics that mattered to me, which is why my chapters are on things like forgiveness and about Black marriage, for example, church discipline, church abuse and dysfunction in the church, that kind of stuff. Those are topics that I really wanted someone to take up and to begin to think out loud about. And so writing it really was an opportunity to have some, to use psychology language, kind of a bit of a catharsis, right? To be, to have an experience of feeling settled and connected, to be the answer to a question that we feel like is important. So we took up topics that we're like, we want somebody to address this. I guess we're going to address it with the hopes that we're obviously not the first or last voice on it, but that it would stir up and cause others to contribute their voice, particularly Black women. So that's why at the very end of the book, you'll see those blank pages that have, musings for your musings. So it's a blank space for you then to add what topic or what concept you want to unpack. Because really that's the hope, is that the book would be a catalyst for more conversations and to hear more and more the voices of Black women.
I love that. And I love the opportunity that you guys give to like just uplift other voices as well. So that's my favorite aspect of it. One of my favorite aspects of it so far. So among other things that you already mentioned really like what you were focusing on in your chapters, but you also write a lot about like church hurt and like church, like, the abuse that, sometimes church doctrines can have on people. So I wanted to know, like, in relation to that particular topic, what would you say is the first step to even acknowledging the trauma that comes from church hurt?
So I think it's important for people to know that they, within their humanity, do not deserve to be mishandled or mistreated. And this is even if you are, as we all are, imperfect people. That's one of the things I really actually liked quite a bit about the Black Lives Matter movement, that philosophical thread about the need to not have so-called perfect victims, right? Because the reality that there's no perfect people, but it is still unjust and it's still wrong to harm a human. Now we can look at that from a humanistic standpoint, just like the value of a human person, but certainly my faith informs my sense of the value of a human being, which is a value that is so high within the Christian context that God's self gave up God's self for humanity. That's right. While we may not see ourselves as having that level of value, we may not see our neighbors of having that level of value. The divine sees us as having great value, great potential, and we're just at our very core humanity. And I think, just a reminder that it's so important. So I would remind people that they have value, they have intrinsic dignity, and that the church is not what it will be yet. And that's my way of saying that there are harms, there are flaws, there's sinfulness, there's whatever word you want to use is still a part of the lived reality of the local church. And so we have to be wise, and we have to understand that is the reality for people. And so twofold, I have kind of two things to think about. One, the care of people who have been harmed directly, but also the ways in which we build and create spaces that are able to be trauma informed, so that we make the community safer and honest and prepared to handle whatever comes its way, because it has not arrived. It is not pristine, without spot or wrinkle, is Christian folks' language. But we also want to attend to the people who have experienced great harm. So being able to think about both of those things are important. So for example, I know people who are really passionate usually about one of those things. And usually it might be they're very focused on the repair of people who've experienced spiritual abuse, which is a more kind of on the nose way of thinking about church hurt. but they may not think about what then will we do to build out the systems, the practices, the leadership training, the requirements to make the church healthier. They might just say, like, forget about it.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say forget about it. Um, but rather I'm going to say that accountability looks like calling something into being what it can be and what it must be. So I think we have to have two hands for both of those things. One hand to attend to the institution itself, and one hand to never forget the people and to care for them well.
Yeah. And I think that is such an important component of it because we got to remember that we're dealing with human beings, you know? It's like we're not dealing with, oh, just the numbers to fill up the congregation at a given moment, or, you know, just like how many souls could we win? Like, you know, we're not putting a numerical value on it because they're not a number, you know, like we're
Yeah,
dealing with a soul, we're dealing with a person who has feelings and emotions and who are looking
absolutely.
for, you know, care and hope, you know, and the
Yeah,
church has to be that place. And I think we should be that place where people can find solace in a community, that they could find peace, they could find like a group of people that are different from what they've been experiencing day in and day out, you know. And so I really appreciate what you said about creating like trauma informed communities. And also, it's kind of like moving from the ground up, you know, like it has to start with the members themselves and then work its way up
yeah.
to the leaders, even, you know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So absolutely. So I think in the book, the chapter I have on disciplining the church, which is kind of a spin on the term church discipline, which people rightfully have all kinds of emotions about. They're like, what is that about, right? Because we've had horror stories around church discipline that usually targets the vulnerable and the weak, versus church discipline that holds to account the powerful and privileged. And I would say that actually is we have to attend to who has power. We have to hold
Right.
accountable to who has power within the community. So that chapter, disciplining the church, it ends with a section where I offer people a series of questions to ask the church community that they are considering, to say like, hey, who are you accountable to? Like, who can tell you no?
Right.
This is a very important question to ask.
That's
Um,
true.
and how can I contribute to this being a healthy community, a healthy and loving community, right? Truly, not just a facade, right? So there's a whole host of questions for people, for those who, for example, are thinking about becoming a part of a local church, but are rightfully anxious about that. So there's some questions that help them to discern. And again, if you're talking to leaders who the idea of you asking them questions about the safety of their community is offensive to them, well, then you already have your answer.
Right. Right. Wow, that's really good. And in continuation with that, even just talking about different like churches, different like faith traditions, specifically on the Black church first, what are some ways that the Black church traditions contribute to that church hurt?
So, I mean, the historic Black church in the United States, right? So it has this, I consider myself to be a great daughter of the Black church. I mean, I love the Black church. I I'm not a fan. I am an offspring. So I take it very seriously. And I will say that my husband, who's a systematic theologian, one of the ways that he talks about the Black church is he talks about it as a living, like an embodied confessional statement. There are traditions that have confessions. And he says the Black church is an embodied confessional statement against white supremacy. Its very existence is like, no, we know who God says that we are. Like, I don't know what you talk about over there, but we know who we are.
Right.
And the music and the traditions reflect that in so many ways. When I think about the honorifics of the Black church, the use of titles, these are some of the things that people are frustrated about. They might feel like it's not egalitarian enough, but the attentiveness to the honorifics is a way to, again, demonstrate that it is an embodied confessional statement against white supremacy. So you might call me a boy out here, but in here, I am deacon such and such. I am brother such and such. I have a title. I have a name. If you think about the Negro spiritual, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes, right? And
Yes.
that might seem silly. That might seem silly to us in this particular century that we find ourselves. But when people literally did not have shoes, they literally did not have a name. They literally did, were disconnected. Their last name, was the name of a plantation. All of that narrative just makes, you're like, oh, that song is deeply spiritual. That song is deeply sociological and powerful when you really think about it. And so I think that is a part of the historic legacy of the Black church. And again, there are a number of traditions and denominations and with all their nuances and variances, right? That need their own separate discussion and rightful respect. I would say, though, that some of the concerns and complaints about the historic Black church are probably rest in some of the consequences of kind of patriarchy, right? So the ways in which the Black church, like most church, like the early church, to be quite frank with you, always had an imbalance of more women. But in society, right, in the world, we see an imbalance based on gender, and we see that very dynamic taking place in the local church as well. So that's one critique that comes up. There certainly are people who would make some critiques based on doctrine, depending on the traditions. There are, I would say, there's a critique that has taken place for well over 100 years about the Black middle class church, the upper middle class, the wealthy, affluent Black church. And I feel like I can pick on that tradition because I feel like I know it really well. That this is a tradition that at times might be super educated, but may not always be motivated to think about the dynamics of poverty and injustice. They too might find themselves incorporating kind of a capitalistic, white supremacist framing on understanding their responsibilities to their neighbor in need. And this is not always the case, but it is not lost on me that during the time of the civil rights movement, there were many, many Black churches that were like, y'all need to hush up, like stop. This is, and right, in some cases, I'm like, well, it was super dangerous. People were dying. So they were like, hey, calm down. The people will kill us, which is true. Right. The people will indeed do that. But there was definitely a real tension with certain church traditions that were like, this is not what we're supposed to be talking about. We're spiritual, not sociological in what we do. And so those dynamics are worthy of analysis and critique. And they still are a part of the Black church landscape today.
Wow, that's really, I never really thought about like the affluent like Black church setting because like, it's kind of almost like a double-edged sword where it's just like, yes, we are like comfortable in our affluence and it gives us the confidence that we need to be, more empowered and speak well on these issues. But then again, as you said, they neglect the people that the gospel is for, the lost and the poor and, those who are not as well off as you are, And so I appreciate that aspect of like, yeah, even the affluent Black church, like they also have their issues. I mean, every church has their own issues, So
absolutely.
Yeah. But I really appreciate like you going in depth on like the positive aspects of the Black church and also just like, even sectors of the Black church as a whole where those church hurt like themes are actually springing up.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so just to kind of go on the other side, in more predominantly white churches, how do you think like racial trauma factors into church hurt, especially from predominantly white churches?
Yeah, so in the context of the United States, white Christians, people who identify as both white and Christian, typically hold as a group, not speaking sociologically, right? As a group, tend to hold more racist beliefs and minimize the realities of racism more than non-Christian white people. So in other words, there's something about the intersection of Christianity and race for the dominant group, which makes them more likely to minimize racial injustice instead of to advocate against racial injustice. Now,
Wow.
that's different for African American people, for example. The research shows that that combination of Christian religious identity and racial identity together for Black Christians actually makes them more probably well versed and more likely to have accurate assessments of racial injustice. That's not the case. So there's some way in which I would say that there's a form of Christianity that works in conversation with white identity that actually creates a greater rigidity to accepting and reckoning with racial injustice. And I would say, I would go one step further to say, makes it more likely to either minimize it or to be complicit in engaging in the harms. And so we have a long history of theologians and Christian air quotes leaders who use their theological training in ways to justify racial injustice, to justify the owning of people, to justify segregation and Jim Crow and you name it, to all of a sudden become incredibly silent about the thousands of lynchings that were taking place from the 1800s to the 1900s, but had many critiques about all the matters concerning to the moral decay of the United States of America, right? But missing the real moral decay that was baked in from its founding, which is the enslavement of people of African descent, as well as the genocide and annihilation and displacement of indigenous people. So that's like right baked in at the beginning of America's story, but also a Christian America, white Christian America story. And so not reckoning with that history means that there is a cancer that is within that particular body. Now, thanks be to God, there are surgeries that can remove some cancers, right? There are treatments. Yes. There are people that go into remission. There are people that become cancer-free, but typically they don't do that because they just, ignored it. Like they got to do the work. And that's a part of the issue that we have. And I think many Black Americans who may find themselves in predominantly white churches are in spaces that typically do not want to do the work. They do not want to acknowledge. At best, they might be adopting a colorblind approach to issues of racial injustice, which is kind of a don't ask, don't tell way of thinking, which is better than the hatred of the segregation of the 1960s, where it was like, no, this is your bathroom, this is my bathroom. But it still is an incredibly low bar, and it's an insufficient bar, and it is out of step with the gospel. Those are the words that the Apostle Paul said to Peter when he was demonstrating cultural legalism and was mistreating the Gentiles in favor of the Jews in that scripture, out of step with the gospel. And I would say in a lot of ways, white supremacist theology and practice is absolutely out of step with the gospel. And which ultimately does great harm to African-American people in those spaces, especially when there is a social matter or a matter within the church that is pretty on the nose racialized. And then they realize that the church is insufficient in dealing with that particular matter. So if you think Trayvon Martin or George Floyd, or so many names, so many social incidences, so much political rhetoric that is not just dog whistling, but like on the nose bigoted. It used to be more dog whistle like in the late 80s, but now it's like on the nose, you people are fill in the blank. They end up experiencing a really deep spiritual trauma from that, because remember, these are the people that are their brothers and sisters in Christ. They have been told that Jesus is enough, and Jesus is making us love each other well. And Jesus does have the power to do that, but not white Jesus, not the one that was made up. That one don't have no power. so that one it gets exposed in times of racial trauma, what Jesus people actually are talking about.
Right. Yeah. That's a really important aspect of it too, because it's just like, I don't think, like when we were talking about before, like creating more spaces for like, trauma-informed communities, I don't think we're creating enough spaces in the church for discussing racial trauma itself, and what that looks like, and how we can actually bridge the gap and use our faith to kind of go into those places and have the grace to actually confront these issues and propose a solution to them. Because it's almost as if we're going backwards instead of moving forward, in terms of like healing. And I think if we address a lot of the issues and just like call it what it is and say, look, this white supremacist kind of framework that we have in the church, it needs to go, because that
Yeah.
is not the gospel. It's not the element of what Jesus taught, and it's not how we should be living our lives as Christians, black or white. So I think what you said was really, really important in terms of like just bridging the gap between like the racial elements and just
Mhm.
really learning how to heal together in a safe space in the church.
Well, and part of that to your, as we talk about this, part of that racial trauma is and spiritual trauma is intensified because there are legitimate doctrines about forgiveness and loving each other, right, and being long suffering that are very true and are foundational and cornerstone to the Christian faith and practice. But when they are weaponized and used in a way to suppress um, needed conversations and needed accountability, you can see how that spiritual abuse is only intensified for people of color who are now
Mm,
told, that you're not charitable, you're not kind, you're assuming the worst, you need to be more forgiving, fill in the blank, right? And
yeah.
that is a way in which we, I would say, take God's name in vain. We take God's word in vain. We misuse it
Hmm.
for our own personal agendas as to not be held account for our sinful behavior towards others. But we are appealing to people's desire to want to be good Christians, whatever that is for them, right? That's what they're wanting to be. And so they don't want to be troublemakers in their community. They want there to be justice and kindness and belonging, for example. But when they raise these topics, they may be met with accusations of being troublemakers, of being bitter, of being unforgiving, and being called an unforgiving Christian is, that's a pretty big slander for those who
Yeah.
have some familiarity with the Christian tradition. Forgiveness is right at it's the nucleus of the faith tradition. And so to get that accusation and to have it weaponized in that way as people dodge accountability around racial justice, you can see the ways it would cause people to really struggle with their self-concept, their relationship with God, um, yeah, their sense of identity, and their sense of morality, right? So it can really send people into a spiral, and that's where we see some of these consequences of spiritual abuse.
Yeah, I really love that. And speaking of identity in the church, um, in the book, you guys like kind of write about like the African diaspora and kind of just examine the phrase like I'm Christian before I'm Black. So can you kind of talk about
Mm.
why you guys wanted to examine that particular statement and what it means to kind of revolutionize the way we think about being a Christian and being Black?
Yeah. So I do think that there have been people who have felt, whatever circles that they're in, that they needed to do that kind of delineation. I have never felt the need to do any type of delineation like that. I mean, it's just, and yeah, I think it is something that is implicitly or explicitly prompted and asked of Black people, to put white people at ease. And which makes it just, obviously not about the good of Black people. It's kind of selfish and self-centering for others to
Hmm.
implicitly or explicitly demand that kind of, I want you to rank these two things in terms of loyalties. And I would say that, you know, we we're not saved to use Christian language. Black Christians are not saved from their Blackness.
Mm.
We're not saved from that. We're not delivered from that. As a matter of fact, the Christian imagery in what is to come is that there are people from every tribe, nation, and tongue. It's distinct and obvious. So it's not like they're all kind of these clones. No, like it's distinct that it's every tribe, nation, and tongue because they're different languages and different appearances and all these things. And so I am not saved away from my African lineage. That is a part of God's providence and shaping me into the person that I am. And it's actually something that God wants for God's self. It's to God's glory that I have this particular background. I think any implicit or explicit call for people to try to have a truncated identity where races, they can kind of say, well, my racial stuff is over here, but really what I am as a Christian, I think is a call to appease whiteness, white identity in some way. And that's not something that we have ever asked white people to do, although I would make the case in the United States context that they actually probably should think about that more, because there's ways in which we see that the racial identity of white does trump, and full pun intended, the Christian convictions that people have said that they have, right? So, and we can see that in the ways in which people will adopt and support political practices that are absolutely opposed to basic, like early education, Sunday school, Christian teaching about being, loving your neighbor, the sojourner, the widow, etc., who dismiss that teaching because of their political interests. And ultimately, when we're thinking about racialized terms, not ethnic terms, but racialized terms are actually political identity markers. So whiteness then is a political identity in the context of the United States. That's what it was developed for. And that is how it's been used, even if people don't say it out loud.
Yeah, wow. I definitely see, especially in a lot of like church settings, just like the removal of ethnicity almost, especially in like predominantly white like spaces. And it's just so funny to me because it's like, well, we all weren't born Christian. You had to become a Christian. You had to get saved. So technically, I'm Black before I'm Christian, but you know, I
Yeah.
mean, like
Well, and
it's
then just the
true.
need to have to just the raising of that dialogue. It's like, what is this serving?
Right,
And yeah, our Christian identity is attached to a being. We're embodied.
right.
So Christianity is not like this amorphous thing that doesn't land on something. It lands on me. And
Right.
I am a human, and these are the things that make up my humanity. So it's not that there's a Christianity that is floating around in this embodied way. We believe in like an embodied reality that bodies are not inherently bad. We're not Gnostic in terms of kind of ancient Christian tradition or heresies. So we have bodies, and our Christianity is in conversation with the very bodies and culture and heritage that we have. And by the
Yes.
way, honestly, this is some version of this. It's not the same racialized version, but some version of this. Some of the fights that we're still having today are all throughout the early church history. If you look at even the Old Testament that Christians refer to as the Jewish Bible, you're going to see some of the same beefs that the people who claim to be God's people aren't taking care of the poor. They are putting people into debt slavery. They are worshiping idols. They are clowning is what they're doing. And you get prophet after prophet after prophet who basically says the same thing, like, stop playing or you're going to end up like the people that you are mistreating. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh my goodness, God deliver me. Because now I'm like the people that I mistreated. And this happens over and over and over. It's kind of a theme, you know what I'm saying?
Right,
And so
right.
it ought to keep us gracious. It ought to keep us not thinking too high of ourselves, like in an elitist way, and really seeking to love our neighbor as ourselves, as Christian tradition calls us to.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And I also wanted to ask you, what is one step that you would like to see the church take in improving their views about race, mental health, like just, like bettering themselves from like engaging in church hurt? If you could choose like one thing, one or two things.
Yeah, we'll see. There's so many things. So one thing I'd like to see the church do is actually to pray. So one, and I know people are like, we pray all the time. Okay, but the distinction of the church is that it's it's called a household of prayer. It's kind of like its distinctive marker, and I think we ought to be praying for to be searched, right? To be examined, to be interrogated for our racial biases, for our kind of entitlement to ignore or subjugate others. I think we do need a season of a revival of prayer, of humility, of reckoning with what is in our heart and what we have been complicit with. So I think that would be the first start. The second start is that I think we need to actually know our history. We need to read.
Yes.
We need to, and we don't need to do the shorthand. We don't need to have our favorite political pundit or news network that is incredibly biased and capitalistic and designed to get you to watch it by any means necessary. We need to read. And what this is one of maybe the only benefit of the internet is that we need to actually, we get access to primary sources. And so we can't sit around and be like, that's not what that person meant. Like I think about like the Civil War, and people are still debating in 2023, why was there the Civil War? Well, we could actually read the Confederate generals' words on this. Like we don't even have to like make up stuff. Like they tell you why. It was states' rights to own people. Like those things go together. They want to own others. It was the economic system of the South, but also the economic system of the West, right? So it's a big deal, lots of profit. So we need to reckon with the truth. And that's going to require that we actually read primary sources. The educator in me is saying like we need to do our learning, and learning is an exercise in humility. You have to acknowledge it's something that you don't know. You have to acknowledge that somebody has something to teach you that you don't already have, and then you have to sit down and take the time and humble yourself and read. And so prayer is another exercise of humility, but we need an entire revival of humility in the church so that we can mature in these things. And as it relates to church hurt or spiritual abuse, talk about it more clinically, is I think we have to assume that there are going to be harms when there's a misuse of power in the church, and that there is power, that there is power in the church, and that it can be easily misused. We should assume that. Like I would say back in the 90s, early 80s, when we had, or throughout the 80s, when we had the HIV epidemic in the United States, and there was just so much harm and craziness and mistreatment of people. Eventually, we got to the place where we started to do this thing called universal precautions, where anywhere you went, every doctor would treat every person as if they had an infectious disease, right? And I actually think that we need to treat every church, every leader, and I love leaders, I work with leaders all the time. We need to treat everyone as if they have the infectious disease of pride, and that we need to build out systems and practices that keep them accountable and safe, and keep the community accountable and safe. We need a kind of a universal practices, best practices, and to assume that we need to put in systems of accountability. So I think those are the things that I would recommend in terms of just spiritual abuse, to know that where there's power, there's gonna be misuse of power, and we need to do something about it on the front end, and not get caught up in like, well, such and such is such a nice person. I'm certain they are, and I do think that most leaders really do have dedicated their lives to the service of people. I believe that wholeheartedly, even despite the painful things I have seen and witnessed, and yet and still, I do think the wisest leaders submit themselves to accountability. It's just like a couple that's getting married. If I'm back when I was doing premarital counseling, I worried most about couples who didn't think they needed premarital counseling. Usually the happiest and healthiest couples are like, yes, let's get premarital counseling, because they're going to have a blast. They're going to sit in premarital counseling and just go on and on about how much they love each other, right? It's going to be, but couples that are doing everything, planning weddings, but doing everything but talk about their marriage, I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
You probably need to be a premarital counseling. And I would say, likewise, healthy leaders are like, yes, hold me accountable.
Yeah. Wow, that was amazing. Well, Dr. Christina, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today. And where can the listeners find you?
Yeah, so I'm out there currently in the social media world. Some days I'm like, Lord, just get me out of here. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at Dr. C. Edmondson. And yeah, and you can check out those books that I mentioned. Fateful Anti-Racism was published by InterVarsity Press, and Truth Stable: Black Women's Musings on Life, Love, and Liberation, Convergent through Penguin Random House. But they are everywhere books are sold. Even the big A that I'll leave the full name of the organization unknown, but that comes to my house more frequently than it should with boxes. But you can purchase this book, but try to find a Black owned bookstore and certainly give them your business.
Yes. Well, thank you again so much. And everyone, stay tuned for more empowering episodes on Rough Edges. Thank you for listening to Rough Edges. This podcast is available on Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and more. For more updates on the Rough Edges podcast, please follow on Instagram at rough.edges.podcast. You can also visit the official podcast website at www.roughedgespodcast.com. If you have any questions or further suggestions for how this podcast can grow, please email at rough.edges.podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.